so much for coming. It's a pleasure. Let me go back to our title slide here. Here you go. This is Biosecurity. What should we be concerned about? And I am just absolutely thrilled to be here. So, of course, I'm Jonathan Klain, and in case you don't know me or can't see my name, could be. And I am Director of Risk Management and Safety Education for BioRaft. And so we'd like to do these fun EHS community webinars and very educational ones, all sorts of different topics. We will have our usual poll probably about 3/4 of the way through, about 40 minutes-ish from now. And so please do engage in that and help us figure out what topics resonate with you the strongest. And I'm very, very happy to have with me two dear friends and colleagues here. As you can see, Kathleen Vogel and Yong-Bee with us, who are experts in this field. And so we just want to try to have a conversation about biosecurity, because it does seem like there's a lot going on with biosecurity, and we may not really be getting a lot of it exactly the way we should. What should we be concerned about, and what maybe don't we need to be concerned about? So quick details, of course, it's Zoom. And so put any fun comments in the chat, say hi, share links, et cetera, but questions that you would like to have our panelists address, please put those in the Q&A. The chat scrolls quickly and we lose track of questions there. So it's in your best interest and ours to have them go in the Q&A where we can see them and all of that sort of stuff. And we will certainly make every effort to get to all of them. If you would like to engage in our fun little poll here and tell us quickly, what's your biggest biosecurity fear right now? It might change by the end of this, which I think is part of our message. Today, go to menti.com, enter the 8-digit code 5056-2095. So 50, 56, 20, 95. Wonder what'll be happening in the year 2095. Sounds like a Zager and Evans tune if you're familiar with songs from the 70s. Now I'm dating myself, and that's my segue to go to my two panelists. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves because they have such incredible storied expertise in this area. I would certainly botch it. So Yong-Bee, you are off mute, so you are on first, sir.
All right, sounds great. So Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on and inviting me. It's fantastic to be amongst a whole bunch of people that are very interested in this topic. And I'm super happy to be on this panel with Kathleen as well, who is an incredible resource and an incredible mind and just a great person. So my name is Yong-Bee Lim. I am currently a fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks, which is a think tank based in DC that really is about de-siloing a lot of these risks that we've siloed: climate, ecology, strategic weapons, and finding out how these things interact and generate security and threat concerns for the United States and for the globe. And in terms of my background, so I just finished my dissertation. So I questioned whether I am an actual expert, because I think a dissertation often leaves more questions than answers. But I finished that in April of 2021, looking at the do-it-yourself biology community, which in the United States, which is a whole bunch of people doing biology work in unconventional spaces, garages, labs that they build in, warehouses, things like that. And in terms of my other background, I guess a lot of my interests have fallen into biosecurity, emerging technology democratization. And I have some government experience as well, where I worked at HHS ASPR, Department of Energy, so at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and also at the Department of Defense, at the National Defense University Center for the Studies of Weapons of Mass Destruction. So really just chuffed to be here and looking forward to a really great conversation.
Fantastic. And I loved our initial discussion, Yong-Bee. And I mean, you have an incredible CV, but you also came highly recommended by both Kathleen, of course, and David Gillum at Arizona State. And so for me, that's plenty.
That's very kind.
Oh, sure. Of course. All right, Kathleen, please.
So hello, everyone. It's so nice to be on this panel with Yong-Bee. You know, I followed his work ever since he started his PhD and was so excited when he decided to look at the DIY biocommunity because I thought this is such a fascinating area and we need more people looking very closely at what some of these groups are doing and kind of what that means for security. So excited to be on this panel and to started collaborating a bit more with him as well recently. And so I'm a professor at Arizona State University in the School for the Future of Innovation Society. I also have the lovely role of being interim director of the school this year. In terms of how I got into this sort of area of biosecurity, as many people who kind of get into the biosecurity line of work, it's usually kind of a random, strangely, oddly, you know, traveled pathway, which hopefully we'll have some time today to maybe chat about how you get into this line of work and maybe how might people be interested in this line of work. I started out as a biophysical chemist, so I got my PhD in biophysical chemistry and you know, realized I didn't want to do bench science for the rest of my life, but they don't really tell you what else you do with a PhD in the sciences. And so I was sort of randomly wandering around the university going, what am I going to do in the future? And basically stumbled into the public policy school on campus. And that's sort of how I got, you know, exposed to some of these issues, you know, back in the early day. And so it sort of took my career path in a very different pathway than maybe I thought when I first entered graduate school, but it's been really exciting and fun and really interesting. And a lot of my research over the years, I would say, has focused on trying to better assess biological weapons threats. Early on, I spent a lot of time looking at state level program, particularly the Russian former Soviet biological weapons program. And then I've gotten in recent years more interested in the whole issue of emerging biotechnologies, some developments in the life sciences, and how should that shape how we think about these kind of threats. So that's kind of a generally, in a nutshell, kind of where my research focus has been over the past few years. And I've also, similar to Yong-Bee, I have spent some time in government. I worked in the State Department in their Bureau of Nonproliferation on some of these issues several years ago. So have a bit of government understanding of how they think and operate, which we can talk about too as part of this discussion if folks are interested. So I think with that, Jonathan, I'll kind of turn it back over to you.
I was muted. Sorry about that. Thanks, Kathleen. Yes. Excuse me. Water went down the wrong way. I'm fine. No worries. Anyway, thank you so much, Kathleen. And so, full disclosure, I am a PhD student, hopefully getting close to PhD candidate in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, where Kathleen is our director. I don't bother with interim, Kathleen, and a professor as well, but not unfortunately not my professor. So, but thank you all. I'm going to stop my share so people can see and everything and just see us as we are here, right? And so maybe a really good starting place is really trying to scope this discussion that, you know, we have the creative title. Are we really even concerned about the right stuff here? So I'd ask the two of you, you know, where do you think we should start? What are your perspectives on really how do we frame biosecurity these days? And I've got two of you. So we're just going to keep going back and forth. So whoever would like to go first is fine. You don't have to be the over polite gophers from the Warner Brothers cartoons, if anyone remembers that great reference. And so I'll ask Kathleen to start just because she's on my left and what the heck.
Yeah, so I'll just kick some things out, but you know, I'm sure we can elaborate and go into more details kind of on various tangents on this. So it's an interesting time for biosecurity, and it is going to be interesting, I think, to track how we talk and think about biosecurity in the coming years, and particularly in light of with COVID and how, to what extent, whether it has changed kind of how we might think about some of these threats. I think it's still to be seen how this unfolds, but it does create an interesting moment of reflection and a different sort of moment than maybe attention that had been focused in past years. As I mentioned, a lot of my work is focused on kind of emerging biotechnology, emerging life science issues. And first, I would say decades, there was a lot of focus sort of with folks looking at kind of the intersection of sort of cutting edge biotech, cutting edge advanced life science work and terrorists. A lot of concern about that, particularly like I would say before 9/11 it started, but then 9/11 really galvanized a lot of, I would say, policy as well as non-governmental attention on sort of this nexus between, you know, advances in science and in the biological sciences and terrorism. And so that commanded a lot of resources at the governmental level, a lot of policy attention, you know, a lot of investment in sort of what I would say investments in preparing for the high-end exotic threats. And again, it's interesting now to kind of look at with COVID, what maybe have those investments and that focus, what has that given us? And again, I think this is still unfolding, how we might think about or, you know, consider COVID. Maybe COVID is an anomaly and, you know, we'll go back to thinking about some of these high-end exotic threats, or maybe it is gonna, you know, reshape and rethink maybe how we might think more about public health threats in general in this space. So I guess I see this is kind of a very interesting moment. And you also see what I find interesting is different actors positioning themselves like inside and outside the government about how they want to position themselves in this debate. And again, it's still unfolding, but it'll be very fascinating, I think, to follow, I would say, with the next couple of years.
Great.
So I'll turn it over to Yong-Bee, actually.
Yes.
Yong-Bee. So I think Kathleen has hit on a fantastic set of points, you know, that there have been these concerns related to biological threats since, you know, I would probably say about the 90s. In particular, we're talking about, in particular, like Al-Machine Rikyo happening in the mid 90s. And then, of course, the Amerithrax incident really kind of kicking things into high gear in 2001. And, you know, just for a little bit of background, I'm not sure what level people are at in terms of their familiarity with biosecurity. So, you know, I often start a discussion on biosecurity, especially with a biosafety group like this, you know, environmental health group like this. You know, biosafety is about, my understanding is it's about making sure that the organisms that people are working with remain contained so they don't harm the people that are doing the work or their environment. And biosecurity is about making sure that the knowledge, the equipment, the pathogens that may be deleterious and may be misappropriated are kept out of the hands of people that are deemed potentially dangerous. And so I think, you know, if you start from that definition of biosecurity, what you realize is that that's a really broad conceptualization, and it really depends also on where you sit. So you have particular circumstances where people may be concerned about certain groups or certain individuals or certain states because they perceive that, oh, you know, they may misappropriate these tools, they may misappropriate these pathogens. And the interesting thing that often happens within the biosecurity realm that we discuss and that muddies the waters is what we call the dual use dilemma. So the idea that the same techniques, equipment, knowledge that may be used to deliver life-saving therapies to people, say like CAR T therapy, or, you know, adenovirus vector therapies to particular types of cells to address cancer cells, or, you know, or deliver vaccines. You know, those types of things may also be used as vehicles potentially then to deliver harmful things. And so there's a lot of discussion about this duality that causes, I think, lots of concern. And I think also what Kathleen brought up about emerging technologies and the narrative around emerging technologies, which is making science easier to do, faster to do, cheaper to do, and more accessible to do, you know, more people have access to the ability to do it, raises these concerns that we are losing control over the things that we might have concerns about, which then exponentially increases our perception of threat. And so I think a lot of Kathleen's work in understanding risk assessment and how we frame risks is so important in how we address the future of biosecurity, because the threat space potentially is so large.
Mm.
But what we need to understand is individuals, organizations, governments can only handle a finite number of priorities.
Yeah.
And so given that particular, rubric at this point, I think it's very important to have very good frameworks through which we assess risk, and therefore assess and assign priority, and therefore then create actionable policy and implementation. So that's really what I wanted to add to the conversation thus far is, we just have to be exceptionally thoughtful when we talk about biosecurity, what it means, where it's been, and where it's going.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this is a great conversation. The way I always oversimplified it for the biomedical engineering students at ASU when I do talks is biosafety, safety inside the lab, biosecurity, safety outside the lab. People out in town, in city, et cetera, care a little bit about biosafety, but boy, don't they care about biosecurity. And technology is going so fast and so quickly that it's a struggle to keep up. And then how do we innovate about risk and perceptions? So we're definitely going to be talking more and more about that. So let's talk about policy and consequences and perhaps unintended consequences. So the two of you with David Gillum at Arizona State also have co-written a paper. I got to see it last night, which was wonderful. It was about the Patriot Act and its implications for biosecurity risks. And again, perhaps some possible unintended ones. So maybe briefly, each of you could tell us a little bit about it and any interesting or practical applications towards our discussion on this that you'd like. And I'm just gonna keep going back and forth. So Yong-Bee, you're on first this time.
Sure. So David, Jonathan, thank you so much for referencing our paper. You said David, and it just suddenly popped into my head.
No worries. David and I are good friends. I take it as a compliment that you called me by his name.
I appreciate that. You're too kind. So the piece was really about, I think, two things. The first thing was it served as a reflection piece. So we wrote a 20th anniversary piece on the Patriot Act, which was passed, after 9/11. In the midst of trying to manage threats to the U.S. homeland, to on U.S. soil. And so there were a number of measures put in place, which with the Patriot Act, increasing surveillance powers, and then there was a pandemic, there was a Bioterrorism Act in 2002 that supplemented some things within the Patriot Act, which then generated additional barriers and measures to limit access and increase safety and security practices in labs that contain particular types of pathogens, federally select agent pathogens. And what the general findings were from a number of studies done at that time was that it tended to increase the cost of doing this type of research. It also really resulted in a type of reverse brain drain. So people could no longer do this type of work in the United States. And therefore, there was this whole bevy of people that wanted to do interesting research in the US, but was not allowed to. So there's a bit of other countries then picking up exceptionally talented individuals, and so it really was a U.S. loss. And it also just drastically increased the cost and the burden upon laboratories to increase their safety and security protocols to be able to address insider threats as well as outsider threats. The idea that people might come in and take stuff versus the insider threat, which is where people on the inside may take things for nefarious purposes. And so, I think that was a number of the main things on the front end. And then the back end really was about understanding that 20 years is a long time in a field. 20 years is a long time related to policy, and things change. And so, just this understanding that the field of biosecurity, the landscape of the life sciences has changed so significantly and so drastically that some of these tools that we used to use from the 80s, 90s, the aughts, about just physical barriers and physical limitations and increasing spending along those lines may have ended up stymieing science in a number of significant ways. And then there are a number of other factors too that we discuss about what the implications are and what we need to think about. And I'm gonna pass that off to Kathleen, because I think that Kathleen was really a force in generating a lot of those thoughts that we were talking about, as well as, if there's anything that I kind of missed on the front end too, of course, that would be great. But Kathleen's thinking really helped inform us along those lines.
Yeah, what do you want to add to this, Kathleen?
Yeah, well, Yong-Bee has given a really great overview of both some of the important history of how that act developed, and then sort of what was implemented, and then what have been some of the aftermath. I would say just kind of commenting more like on the university perspective. It is a point now, again, 20 years out, whether we need to be sort of thinking, how well did the Patriot Act do in terms of actually increasing or creating better biosecurity, and in what ways has it not, with some of these new changes in the scientific landscape? How is it not? Do we need to be preparing, let's say, for example, in universities for how to address kind of these new challenges? And I would say also related to what Yong-Bee said about the monetary burdens on universities. They're pretty much to implement basically the Patriot Act for universities and labs that do this kind of work. There isn't sort of a special extra like money bucket for like paying for these kind of increased security measures, and not only just the security measures themselves, but basically the staff, the administrative personnel that actually need to provide the oversight and actually keep track of things. And so that has often been something that the mandate has not always come along with enough resources to cover the whole scope of costs when you're talking about these major security enhancements. And some of them are definitely valid. You want to have better security, and you want to have a means to make sure that materials don't just walk off, or that an insider doesn't come in and who has a grudge and wants to do something nefarious can get away with it. But I think we do need to be thinking about what is the overall cost of all of these increased measures, and can we rethink that potentially? So that's just maybe something else I would add, kind of from the university perspective on this.
Yeah, having worked in the field of environmental health and safety and worked for two dean's offices in colleges of engineering, it was always intriguing to me, and I was always right in the middle of it, is here's a safety requirement, here's a need we have to do, such as, let's say, biosecurity. Where's the money going to come from, right? Which people think, well, the university all has money, it's all one bucket. It doesn't really work that way. Yeah. Well, so let's go further with this. And as far as issues to be aware of about biosecurity, can we see them? Are they observable empirically, as that phrase is used in research? Maybe a little bit of comparing and contrasting, what we know, what we don't know, what should we be paying more attention to versus what we perhaps don't need to, or where we're paying attention and we aren't paying attention somewhere else. So is this, again, the nefarious entities? Is it the DIYers? Help us understand that a little bit better. And so, as I said, I'll alternate. So Kathleen, back to you again.
Okay, so I'll just probably mention maybe one thing that has been on my mind recently, kind of thinking about how do we start thinking maybe slightly differently about biosecurity for the future? How about we put a different emphasis on things? And one area that I think is going to continue to demand a lot of attention is what people often refer to as kind of the digitization of biology. So the fact that there's so much more information now that's digital, that's online, that you don't actually, in many cases, you don't need the actual pathogen itself, the actual physicality of it. You need the information, and in some cases, the information to be able to synthesize it from scratch now. So I think this is an area that I think there is attention being placed on it, but I think you're going to see just much more focus on how do we deal with kind of these informational aspects of these now biosecurity risks, and what does that mean, for example, in terms of, do we need to be thinking more carefully about cybersecurity kind of issues in labs, and how we think about that. You know, and along those various lines, sort of what kinds of information, either separately or in aggregation, could pose new kinds of risks, and who are we most concerned about, you know, related to that. And if you kind of have followed the news, you've probably seen that China has become an increasing focus of concern, and there's been a lot of different reports and accounts of how there's been a lot of Chinese entities that have been involved in trying to hack into different healthcare systems to acquire biomedical data, or into scientific institutes to acquire, you know, different kinds of scientific data. And so there's a lot of questions about, you know, what could that information be used for? Do we need to be worried about these kinds of risks? It's no longer now, let's say, a terrorist storming into a facility, but what if they're able to do it electronically and enter into a database or system and acquire information that way? And so, again, I see this as a big area that's going to be emerging as a new focus of how do we deal with these informational aspects of security on the biological side.
Great, great. And Yong-Bee, and I know your focus has very strongly been on DIYers in particular, so I'm sure you'll discuss that a little bit too.
Yeah, so, you know, part of it will be on DIYers, part of it will just be picking up on Kathleen's excellent points about cyber biosecurity or cybersecurity, depending on who you talk to. You know, so I did a piece a while ago on the digitization of biology, and one of the things that was a particular interest to me was there's this perception that all the data that is just digitally available is 100% accurate, 100% replicable, you know, all of this stuff. And as we consider the implications of, you know, as we increase the bioeconomy and use these like digital resources to produce physical products, this is a resource that simultaneously needs to be protected, but also properly curated, because there are a lot of fidelity issues from what I've heard and from what I've seen in terms of genome sequence banks. And there could be sabotage attempts where individuals might change one set of sequences that could result in having something that used to be innocuous, but might have, you know, might be something quite different that you don't necessarily expect. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding these curveballs. In terms of the DIYers, it was a fascinating project. So I refer to it as a community-based project because I could not have done it without the benefit of community lab leaders and members from spaces like BioCurious in California, as well as Counterculture Labs and Bugs in Baltimore and GenSpace in New York, and just all these wonderful, fantastic, and Boss Lab in Boston, all these wonderful, fantastic places. And what inspired me was when I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, I had heard about the do-it-yourself biology movement, about how as people get greater access to technology, it's cheaper to do in your own home, you know, materials are easy to acquire. There was this narrative that it would just be really easy to have a whole bunch of garage bioterrorists just suddenly come out and do all sorts of things. And as someone who was studying biodefense, that was very concerning. So 2016, when I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, I met a founder of a do-it-yourself biology lab, Patrick, who took me to Counterculture Labs and was like, check us out, like, you know, see what we're up to. We're entirely open and transparent here, and we want you to experience this and learn science and engage. And over time, what I realized was there are ideological issues clearly that don't align with terrorist actions in relations to the do-it-yourself biology community. They're very inquisitive and peace-loving and just like are really about finding ways for everyone to be able to engage in science. Because science, in a lot of ways, is being framed as the future. Lots of opportunities are tied to biotech and the bioeconomy, and community labs and the do-it-yourself biology movement sees itself as a way for people to gain access where they might not normally have that access. But there are also capabilities issues, and Kathleen would not be surprised at all with some of the things that I found, which was because it's an all-volunteer organization, it's not very stable in terms of the people, in terms of the organization sometimes. So you need stable cohorts to be able to work over a long period of time to do complex scientific tasks. And that's not a thing that you often see in the do-it-yourself biology community. The equipment, they might get it from eBay, but for every 3 that they purchase, they might have 1 that maybe works. There are all these limitations, logistical, equipment-wise, tacit knowledge-wise. So the transfer of knowledge from knowledgeable individuals to those that are less knowledgeable, that really stymie a lot of the kind of capabilities that are potentially nefarious, but really optimize the ways that people can intrinsically engage in science. So I see them as a really good source. And I kind of want to just platform and end on a kind of interrelated story, which is about how it's so important for biosecurity experts to engage with the communities that are affected by our thoughts and that are affected by our words and actions. So this was one example with the DIY bio community, but also there was a time when I was in Singapore talking to a scientist there who was involved in the military. And we had a very candid conversation about she said, "I don't like you biosecurity people." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's an interesting place to start, but let's go with it. What don't you like about biosecurity people?" And she said, you make us do all sorts of forms, you make us check out all these boxes, you add all these burdens on us, and you take away my toys. And so I relate that as a story to go. It is so important as a community that wants to look for safeguarding the lives of people, and we need to make sure that we understand what the issues are on the ground as well. We need to understand and build common frames of references with different communities. Otherwise, we could generate the most stringent and best biosecurity planning in the world, but if people don't buy into it, then we're almost worse off, and we just wasted a whole bunch of effort.
Oh, definitely. And I love the conversation. It was interesting what her concern was. And I think these issues revolve around several things, but it's, a lot of it is, as Yong-Bee, you and I have spoken about in particular, and with Kathleen as well, are risk perceptions, right? And the general public's perceptions of risk often don't align really well. Just take a look at COVID, right? It's taught us many things, but that our risk perceptions vary widely and wildly. So we've talked a little bit about it, but is there anything else that we've left on the table for how the pandemic maybe has affected discussions around biosecurity risks? And if you feel like, in the interest of time, we've really covered it fine, that's fine as well. And we can kind of segue into taking it from the current pandemic to what about future perspectives, the realities, what we've gotten wrong, et cetera. So I think I need to go to Yong-Bee if I'm doing this alternating who's first or not, although I'll claim to be confused by my whole process.
No, I think it's a great question. I think we've answered the general contour of it, but the one thing that I might want to add is biosecurity is a weird field in the sense that as unfortunate as it is, there's an element of when things go pear-shaped, that's when the funding starts becoming available for biosecurity projects, biosecurity initiatives. So as an individual, as a citizen of the world, the last thing that I want is something horrible to happen, which is why I'm in the field. But unfortunately, you start getting funding when things go pear-shaped. So there's and there's a time limit on that too. So biosecurity often has to deal with what's commonly referred to as feast and famine cycles. So when something happens, then there's just an enormous outpouring of funding to prevent the next possible issue. And when the next issue doesn't happen, then the funding completely dries up. And it's very problematic because we can't necessarily tell. This goes to the empirical question, because there's so few cases in terms of what I would really look at as biosecurity. So, bioterrorism actions in particular, that it's very hard to predict what the trajectory will be. And Greg Koblenz has actually written a number of great articles related to the schools of thinking of biosecurity in terms of, is the threat increasing, is the threat decreasing? And it depends, it depends on whether I've had my coffee or not. So yeah, I think that that's just a really important thing to bring up, that there's a lot of insecurity in bioinsecurity. And
maybe we should rename it bioinsecurity.
Yeah, I mean, hey, I haven't really heard that before. So you could I think you can claim that you did that. But yeah, so I would just say there's an insecurity to biosecurity, and I would just also say that because there are so few incidents, we have a lot of difficulty understand what's working, what's not working, and therefore calibration can be very difficult.
Yeah, and I agree. Kathleen, what do you want to add to this as well?
Yeah, probably the one thing that strikes me just from thinking about the impact of COVID and maybe what it has revealed that maybe was more hidden was just the vulnerabilities of our sort of scientific infrastructure to dealing with a situation like COVID. Like I'm thinking just even like basic supplies and equipment, PPE, and the fact where we were so dependent on Chinese sources for so many different supplies, and the supply chain issues, which again, we're still dealing with that now. And this affects labs, as well. And one other, I remember just reading it. I was talking to a biodefense researcher a bit ago we were talking about how these articles had come out about in the middle of the pandemic. One of the other kind of critical supply issues that was revealed that was vulnerable was animals for animal testing. For example, the COVID vaccine, that we relied, for example, on a lot of primates from China. And when the pandemic hit, those animal sources were not available for animal testing. And so again, kind of revealing these vulnerabilities of how we've become dependent on other countries for different basic supply systems, I think is problematic. And even how, how we operate, how labs operate, for many universities, a lot of laboratory work was shut down or really put on pause during the COVID time. And even labs now are trying to sort of come back on track and, restart and sort of think about how they, restart work that maybe might have been decades in the making and that had to be paused, and there were significant consequences from those. So just sort of how do we do biosecurity work in the midst of these kinds of disruptions? I think that's something which, I don't know we really thought about before until the pandemic sort of revealed, wow, there's a lot of things that we kind of took for granted, that things were going to operate as usual, and they didn't.
Yeah. No, I get it. Let me kind of follow up on, the term disruption really comes to mind, including, it was posted in the Menti poll, disruptions, and a lot of what we're talking about, perceptions, risk perceptions. They may be misperceptions, but our perceptions of risk are what drive us and drive us batty, pun unintended, I guess. But so thinking more broadly, it could be a potential threat to something in our ecology, our crops, our food supply, our water supply, resources, et cetera. The logistic chain obviously has been severely impacted by all sorts of things with this. So maybe, how do we build walls or constraints to limit, the scope of attention so it doesn't overwhelm people and they lose interest, but also how do we deal with just the thought that, you know, someone can claim to have done something, and then immediately that has an anchoring effect for people. And then you try to prove that no, that did not take place. People start to believe that government or scientists aren't telling the truth, et cetera. So just kind of the both sides of it, which I think has been a theme for us. So Kathleen, do you mind starting us off on that?
Gosh, I
I
might
know
have to
it's
think a
big.
bit.
I do this a lot. I go in multiple directions, and then the panelist is like, where do you want me to go with this, John?
Yeah, so I might think about, I mean, I think again with the COVID-19 and maybe how it might impact other sectors, really thinking about, and this kind of connects to maybe some of the comments I made just now, kind of thinking about resilience and how do we build in resilience into different systems, whether we're talking about like the food supply or other systems that we're dependent upon as a country, like really thinking about that. And again, I would say this is like more some of these basic things, as opposed to, as I sort of mentioned when we first started, that, you know, there was so much emphasis in the 90s and 2000s on protect against these really high end exotic threats, you know, that were imagined to be the ones that would materialize and that would be our greatest threat. And again, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of opened up that there's a lot of ways, you know, in basic things, in our basic infrastructure where we might have vulnerabilities, and maybe we need to take a fresh look at those kinds of things, and how do we build in preparedness and resilience in those areas, as opposed to, again, putting all of their biosecurity funding in this high-end threat imaginary.
Good. Yeah. Yong-Bee, what about you? Which of my many directions would you like to go? And I think after you're done with your response to this, we'll probably launch our poll on topics. I'll talk about future webinars, and then we'll address the questions that are in the Q&A. And if we still have time, I mean, we have so many questions still left on the table here. I feel like we're going to have to do a part 2 or something like that. But please, Yong-Bee, what direction do you want to go on this topic in particular?
Well, 2 things first. Always happy to do a part 2, and then number 2. I am glad that Kathleen had first shot at this particular question, so it gave me a little bit of time to think, because those are a big series of questions, and I think, you know, I think part of it, so it touches on several things. I think that one of the things that we've witnessed, particularly during COVID, and it's going to become a norm, not an abnormality, is the misinformation elements that we're having to deal with when it comes to, you know, various elements of related to COVID, whether it's the vaccine, whether it, you know, vaccines, whether it is, you know, certain activities or masking, you know, these types of issues. And I think part of what drove that there are various elements, but I'll really kind of hone in on 2. And the first is, it seems like there is a kind of lack of faith in government that has been precipitating people to wonder, well, if I can't trust my government, if I can't trust my experts, then who can I trust? And people can really, you know, in a world full of zombie films, what do people see? People rely upon themselves and potentially upon the people around them. So there's an element there, and I think the other element too is people kind of got to see the messy side of science. A lot of people, I think, had a very ivory tower pedestal version of science in their heads, where, oh, science is one answer, it does not change over time. And seeing a lot of the, what I will term politely, debate online in relations to various scientific reports and their interpretations has confused a lot of people. And we have not, as, you know, scientists, done citizens the service that they deserve in terms of allowing the perpetuation of this idea that science is monolithic and perfect. And so I think there's an element here where, if there's a lesson that hopefully can be learned, it's making sure that citizens are aware that this is a normal part of the process with science. Perhaps not the vitriol, but this process of going through is a normal part of the process, and don't be scared by it. And I think another element that I just probably like to pick up on really quickly is, as Kathleen is talking about, maybe we need to reassess, and I agree. I think we need to reassess and understand what are the threats that are facing us from what areas and in what methodologies.
Mm.
The life science is no longer filled with just life scientists. It's not just biologists, molecular biologists, geneticists. It's not just this group. It's expanded in a lot of very interesting ways, including, computer scientists and physicists and, just data analysts and just all of these new disciplines. And in a way that provides new frameworks for people to work with in terms of the life sciences. So synthetic biology is, in a sense, a new framework of how we do biology. It's an engineering application to the life sciences. And with that cognition in mind, we need to do two things. The first thing is we need to make sure that we expand our aperture and include a broader group of people and experts in these discussions as we build, because we may be able to find new solutions that we did not have in the past. And then the second thing is we need to make sure that as these people are incorporated into our discipline, and as we are incorporated into their discipline too, it needs to be, a two-way street. We make sure that these people are also aware of how to make sure that the work that they do is safe, secure, ethical, just all of the things that we try to inculcate and focus exclusively on our life sciences individuals at this point. I mean, this isn't the 1990s, 1980s anymore. As Kathleen has been pointing out, this is the 2020s, and here we are, and we need to make sure that we address biosecurity in a 2020 fashion.
Yep, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great conversation. I wish we had 2 hours here, but we don't. And, my quick 2 cents, and my friend and colleague, Chris, will launch our topic poll. You can see upcoming ones. Please note that there is a gap, not only for the holidays, because of course, everyone is just so busy around the end of December and then getting everyone back in January. So you can see a little bit of a gap there. But a quick mention that we're starting to introduce other educational things into our biweekly stream and elsewhere outside of the biweekly. And for our customers, obviously, it's a little different because it involves our customers. We do have a panel talk similar to this on how are you dealing with turnover and churn. Everyone is leaving, mass migration, mass resignations, et cetera, going on. And so that's being hosted by my colleague here, Lacia, on the 7th. So if you happen to be one of our customers, look for messaging on that. But Chris you can launch the poll whenever you would like, please. And there we go. He's so prompt. He's so good about this. Chris and I do a lot of looking at these results, folks. And so please answer the questions. Kathleen and Yong-Bee are looking at them intently, but as it says in red at the bottom of ours, hosts and panelists can't vote. Yeah. But anyone, Kathleen, Yong-Bee, or anyone out there, you can and should always feel free to shoot me an email, jonathan.klain@bioraf.com. Any thoughts you have, panelists, topics, things we should be doing, et cetera, et cetera. I am always super thrilled by that. So please do. And we always look at this quite a bit. Yeah, very much. So good. All right. Let's, and I feel like we've barely covered this stuff, but I mean, that's just the nature of the beast here. We did have a question in the chat, and I want to make sure I don't lose it. So I will ask this one because I think it's something that we're talking about. So it's from Rebecca, and my dear friend and colleague Patrick Ryan has been commenting very, very well in the chat and the Q&A on this. And Kathleen and Yong-Bee, you talked about this. How do we engage? with others, you know, the people that we're trying to help, right? But they, as Yong-Bee got at with his great little micro story there, they don't see it as help, right? You know, and so what Rebecca asks is, how do you create and foster buy-in from people working with these materials? And I think it relates to Maria's question. Can you share ideas on how to implement, improve biorisk management, biosecurity in research labs that work with high consequence pathogens? So my guess is those two are going to be similar enough to chunk them together. And Kathleen, you have a great look on your face. You look like you're ready to tell us, you know, some really wonderful stuff here. So I'm going to go to you first.
Okay, yeah, so I guess related to Rebecca's question, like just, and this was swirling in my mind before when Yong-Bee was talking about working with the DIY communities and just the importance of engagement. It just reminded me of sometimes the controversial histories of establishing high containment laboratories in the US, and how, you know, in certain cases, there's been opposition by local community groups to the construction of these labs, even though the work that goes on there, one could argue, is really important to understanding dangerous pathogens, you know, you know, their potential natural or otherwise threats. And I remember reading an article sort of that compared what had happened with the Boston University high containment lab, which was it was really controversial, and it was cited in a low income community area, and the community, several of the community members sort of rallied and opposed it and protested, and there was all kinds of opposition to it, and it caused a lot of problems for the construction of that facility. And I'm not saying that was, you know, that was valid or not, but just sort of talking about when you don't do early engagement, it can cause sort of unintended problems down the road. And just comparing that, I think there was an article, and again, I can't remember who wrote this, where they compared the Boston experience with that of, I think it was at Texas A&M and their high containment lab there, and how that lab had a very different strategy from the very beginning, was much more focused on inviting members of the community in. They had members of the community on their sort of design and planning board for that lab. They had a variety of different opportunities for community members to come and visit the facility and sort of get acquainted with the work and better understand what was going on there. And again, that doesn't necessarily squelch opposition, which in some cases could be valid, but it does provide these kinds of close engagement kind of activities can be a way where you can at least try to create trust or try and create open communication between scientists working in some of these facilities and people in the communities where they're going to be located. So, so it probably relates very much to sort of Yong-Bee's work on the DIY bio, where, you know, people value having the opportunity to engage, you know. So that's sort of my thoughts kind of on that particular issue. I don't know, I'll turn over to Yong-Bee to see if he has other ideas.
Yeah, Yong-Bee, what do you think about this area? How do we engage with others and help persuade the things that we're most interested in, but maybe how do we have that conversation?
Right. So I think Kathleen hit it, you know, perfectly. The thing I guess there are two things I might add. And the first thing is, no one ever likes to feel used. And so I think that when you're engaging communities, it can't be from the perspective, as Kathleen noted, it can't just be an engagement that happens because you need something. It has to be an engagement that exists potentially beforehand. And, you know, that was, I mean, I'll just pull my case of the DIY bio community again, to whom I'm very thankful, that, you know, I didn't approach them about actually doing field research in their spaces until 3 years after I'd really been engaged with the community. It wasn't just this, you know, plan from the beginning that I was going to do my dissertation there, but having those 3 years of experience and kind of straddling these two separate worlds gave me, I think, a very unique perspective that they were very receptive to. And so they could see the utility in me being engaged in these spaces. And I could see the utility not only for them, but for the biosecurity community as well, in understanding what is the actual threat represented here. Oh, it doesn't actually seem to pass muster compared to what's often in the literature. So I think that's one element that you can't just go to someone and expect something in return. And I think, the other element for me too is biosecurity. The biosecurity community often thinks, and I don't think it's deliberate. I think that there's an insular quality to the community because it's small and we only have so many people engaged in this space. But sometimes it helps to just do little gut checks, right? So, if you do have those networks that you've generated without expecting anything in return, down the line, you can reach out to someone and go, hey, I have this idea of having people in high containment labs wear smartwatches as a way of potentially detecting, increased temperature, which might indicate a prodrome period, which might indicate someone may be becoming sick. And I have never set foot in, well, I mean, I have, but I have never worked in, a high containment lab. I don't have the necessary context of someone saying, well, that would interfere with, the way that I operate because, the risk, the smartwatch won't fit in a particular location, or I can't use it, or it's a military installation and I'm not allowed to have. There are these ways to get feedback that then feed into, oh, these are methodologies that won't work because there are very real constraints. So it goes back again to just me, to something I think I said earlier, which was understand what's happening on the ground. Because if you don't, again, best intentions in the world, best potential policy, it won't pass muster.
No, I totally agree. I think that this is really a great conversation, and my certainly biased view, given it's what I study, is how do we develop relationships? How do we use our soft power skills much more? How do we engage with people? Even some design thinking. How do I get the stakeholders involved in the actual design so that it's going to work for them, as the both of you are saying? And then really getting at what I study, how do we have discussions, conversations really about our risk perceptions, and use stories and story form to share, to relate, to bond, to contextualize, to make meaning from it, to make it understandable instead of just top-down information, we know best, et cetera, which I think we all know does not work well. And COVID has really demonstrated that quite strongly.
Yeah. And Jonathan, just as a note too, what you're talking about as well is you're creating a combined culture. You're creating a reality between a number of people, a number of organizations through this common frame of how we interpret a story, how we acculturate. And that is so important because I think people often think, well, if I have a really great idea, people will see the brilliance of the idea. And I mean, having been a PhD student, having been a junior researcher, of course, I've had that mentality when I've gone to some senior person and went, this is the best idea since sliced bread. And they go, I have no clue what you're talking about. So that's a key too, the ability to build a common frame of reference, the ability to tell stories in a compelling way that then allow us to find potential areas where we can interact and build together. I think is a really powerful lesson there.
If I need to, in my dissertation, cite how stories help with acculturization, I'm going to cite you, Yong-Bee, in this discussion. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
No, I suppose you could do that. I mean, this is being recorded and it will be out there somewhere. So yeah,
exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a question in the Q&A, and if anyone has other questions, please feel free. So the question in the Q&A, we are on the hour. We can go back for a little while to our questions, but we may just think in terms of part 2 for this, because there's a lot still that we left on the table here. But Caitlin did ask early on, so I definitely want to get to hers. So Caitlin asks, I'm interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on zoonotic diseases and how biosecurity can be improved, maybe considering the One Health concept, and that's all capitalized. So you're both nodding. So you're up on this much more than I. And she wrote parenthetically, happy belated One Health Day. So there you go to that as well. So Kathleen, I'll go to you first in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think for so long, people have been advocating that we need to think about sort of health and disease prevention and protection kind of more holistically, and not only think of like human health, only human health threats, but sort of how, you know, humans can acquire diseases from animals and other sources, which is the whole like kind of One Health concept, is trying to think about these disease systems more holistically and how do we improve health overall across these systems. And I think, you know, with the COVID-19 outbreak, I think that has also maybe reignited some interest in kind of thinking about this. Again, you know, we still have to think, the jury's still out on the origins of COVID-19, but you know, it does raise this question of should we be thinking more about this, and will that just help us to protect both animal and human populations smarter and more effectively. So, I mean, yeah, I would say I'm a proponent of that, you know, trying to think about it more holistically. And I'm going to turn over to Yong-Bee.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to talk at all about the debate on the COVID original source. But Yong-Bee, what about Caitlin's question on zoonotic diseases?
Yeah, so I think that first of all, it's a fantastic question, and happy One Health Day as well. And it really gets to this idea that as you know, as we're more interconnected, as we're more globalized, threats that happen, you know, in the life, you know, from biology can travel the globe in an exceptionally short period of time. And I think that it's exceptionally smart to think about how biology can have global effects. Clearly, COVID is an example of how biology can have global effects, you know, but we can even look to the past with MERS-CoV, or, you know, there are plenty of examples throughout history. And I think it's a really good thing to think about these problems, not only within the context of biosecurity alone holistically, like seeing how biology affects the world, but also how biology is interacting in very interesting and potentially deleterious ways with other phenomena. So at the Council on Strategic Risks, we've really been trying to look at this intersection of ecological degradation, which obviously has impacts on spillover effects, biology, and also climate change, which has huge impacts on, like, you know, internal and external migrations, you know, pathogen migration. There's a whole bunch of phenomena that can be rolled into how we consider things, not only individually, even in a One Health holistic fashion, but with other levers and other issues as well. And so I think it's really important for us to consider not only one item, although we're approaching it in a holistic fashion, it's really important for us to understand how all of these things are interacting. And so there's an element here, as much as science in some ways is about, you know, order, bringing order to the universe, understanding from our conceptions of what the universe is to what it, and bridging what it should be to what it is, you know, all of these types of things. There's an element too where we have to embrace the chaos. We have to understand that there are all sorts of things happening in all sorts of very weird, beautiful, horrible ways. And until we understand that, I think we're going to be stuck in a situation where we might be able to make some headway on one issue, but that issue is going to change so drastically because of the other things affecting that issue on the outside, that we'll constantly be in a reactive and potentially more lagged response role, as opposed to getting ahead of the threats and the issues that we face. And so I would advocate, like, we need to think very carefully about this. I think One Health is a very useful framework for thinking about global health in certain aspects. It doesn't cover all items. I think it's a bit weak in the deliberate side compared to accidental or natural. But we also need to understand that biology, the life sciences, is just one element that we need to be looking at across a vast map of nodes of issues that we need to be considering as we make our way forward.
Yeah, no, this is great. And we've had people in the chat, Patrick and Nikki in particular, have been thanking us for this, and it looks like Alessandra as well. Everyone's interested in a part 2. So I'm not going to try to cover all of the questions, but there's one area that the three of us talked, when we had our meeting before, we were all very passionate about. I'm just coming off of a SHEMA, the Campus Safety Health Environmental Management Association panel discussion on DEI and safety. You may have seen that in a month from now, we have our own webinar that we've been setting up, where we have 3 panelists, Anthony Appleton at Colorado State, who deals with safety culture, Renetta Tull, Vice Chancellor of DEI at UC Davis, whom I know, and Robert Nobles, VPR at Emory, whom I now know as well, and talking about JEDI, so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and what is the nexus between those two cultures, JEDI culture, or DEI if people prefer, it's fine, and safety culture. And so towards that end, the three of us talked a lot about challenges and issues and shortcomings of the pipeline, meaning future researchers in this space, future professionals who really, look at things very, very deep. My going through my PhD program opened my eyes to how deeply we get into the topics. I thought I knew a lot about risk before joining the PhD program at ASU, and now, working towards finishing it, it was just Dunning-Kruger effect. I didn't realize how much I didn't know about it, right? So what are, as our last question, our segue out here, and I'll go back to Yong-Bee, I'll go back to my alternating, and Kathleen, I'll give you the last word. So Yong-Bee, maybe briefly touch on this. We can still leave some of this on the table as well for part 2, but I'm sure you know what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question, and I hope it's a powerful one to leave people with, because I think it's a really important question. And Kathleen brought it up really early on in our discussion when she talked about how the path to biosecurity is not, it's not a direct one. It's a lot of happenstance and serendipity. So my pathway was from psychology to international relations to eventually this field, but it's difficult in a number of ways. And I really want to commend a lot of my leadership at CSR, as well as experiences I've had at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, at the Center for Global Security Research, and the Center for Studies of Weapons of Mass Destruction at NDU, for really providing me with opportunities that I know that not many people necessarily have access to. Just the experts that I happen to be very fortunate and privileged to be able to interact with. And it's not as I mentioned kind of towards the beginning, security is not the most diverse space. So as an Asian American and as a person that identifies as queer, it's a very weird space to be operating in, because there are very particular images of people that you expect to be in these spaces. And so, I'm hoping that as we realize that we need to increase the aperture, we need to find diverse communities and diverse ideas to address future problems, there will be more people like myself, more people like David Gillum, more people like Kathleen Vogel, more people that represent a broad variety of, a broad variety of backgrounds, because it's been tough every once in a while, but I think that I see hope. I do see more diversity, And so I think that it's just really important to keep in mind that diversity is the future. Diversity will help us manage the problems that we face in the future. And we need to intrinsically be thinking about that and actively incorporating it as we think about how we address the challenges of getting people into these spaces.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a really, that's just a really important thing, at least for me.
Yeah,
And
no,
my
and I think it's
experience.
very well said, Yong-Bee. Thank you. All right, Kathleen, you get the last word and I'll do our outro.
Yeah, well, I would love to see more of Yong-Bee's in the biosecurity field. He's, I think, an exemplar of like, we want more of that. And so how do we do that? And I will say, I've also been very interested and concerned about wanting to have sort of the next generation of biosecurity folks, be more diverse and just have that be seen as a career path. And I think it is hard. I didn't stumble into it until I was basically late in my graduate school years. And I think that's in a lot of ways, that's where people kind of find out about this career path. And I would love to see younger students be exposed and know that if you want to work on biosecurity issues, there are a number of really interesting career paths. You could work in the government, you could work for a national lab, you could work more in the environmental health and safety kind of angle of it, you could work in academia. But I think as a high school student, undergrad, you just really are not aware that there are really viable and really interesting career paths in this. And I would love to see more opportunities. And this gets into maybe a funding issue. Could there be more resources to fund students to do internships like in different areas and just open their eyes to this bigger biosecurity world where we need great thinkers and great people. So I would love to see more of that in the future.
Yeah, great. All right. I know, and my last words on that are, I think I agree with you. I think the diversity and inclusion efforts would be wonderful, and to have those diverse backgrounds and people with diverse thoughts on this space. And then, of course, I'm always going to come back to the, risk perceptions and storytelling as a solution. Of course, not necessarily the solution, but a solution towards this end. So on that note, I think we're going to have to look at doing a part 2 in the spring or sometime around there. And I hope everyone continues to come back. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, etc. And thank you again so much to, of course, everyone who comes and attends these, but thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you very much, Yong-Bee, for coming and sharing with us your expertise in this really challenging to understand area. I think it's been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to part 2, and we'll see what directions we go in by then. All right. So for everyone here at BioRaf, thank you all very, very much. And we look forward to seeing you future times. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
You're
thanks,
quite
Jonathan.
welcome. Yeah, absolutely a pleasure. We'll talk to you both later. Take care.